I want to talk to you today about why you should build open source license awareness into your CI/CD. And I also want to give you some pointers as to how to actually do that. So we're going to do this. It's a little participatory. Of course, I didn't counter in that this is a cinema room and I can't see you so well. But I want to see a show of hands, like who is using open source in their code bases. I don't see all hands raised, and that's hilarious because you're wrong, because you're all using open source in your code bases. The 2022 Open Source Security and Risk Report examined the results of more than 2,400 commercial code bases, and the results came back that 97% of those contain open source software. Some of them even contained 100% in their commercial code bases, and that was specifically in the industry sectors, semiconductors and hardware, cybersecurity, energy and clean tech, and IoT. So all of you are using open source. Surprise. And we're all using open source because it allows us to move fast and sort of maintain that commercial edge, right? But in doing so, we're trusting that strangers on the internet know and understand the license that they release their software under. And also, we trust that vendors won't change their minds onto how or who can actually take care or can use all of that software either. So we're building stuff on a little shaky ground there. So to illustrate the point, if you install Electron, you'll add 87 packages, and that means 87 license dependencies. And every single package is likely to have their own dependencies as well, and that's another license that you'll need to comply with. As you can imagine, license management can become really a big thing. It's not something that you can do manually anymore, and if you do it incorrectly, you create technical debt. And dependency graphs, I don't know if you've ever looked at your dependency graphs, but they look scary, yo. So let's look at some ways to maybe remedy some of that. Why? Because license litigation can end up forcing you to release your software under the license that of a component that you're using in your code base. Other potential problems include being sued for financial liability by the creator of the component, and you might get bad press and bad negative reputation. So shifting left dependency, but also license dependency management to the build or deploy stages prevents you from being non-compliant in production and maybe losing the trust of your customers. So today I want to look at some projects that have relicensed recently, and I want to look at how we can track and manage our license dependencies upon deployment, and how we can set up to respond to projects maybe changing their terms. Who am I then? My name is Floor. Hi, I am based in the Netherlands. I'm a staff community program manager at Ivan.io. We manage your favorite data tools, Kafka, Flink, ClickHouse, Postgres, MySQL, I can go on. And we're very involved in the upstream projects as well. So I always say we manage your data tools without exploiting the projects or their maintainers, promised. Previously, I worked at Grafana Labs and at Microsoft. I'm a DevOps Days core organizer. Who's ever been to a DevOps Days event? Maybe? Oh, 2 whole people. Hi. So I also organize the DevOps Days Amsterdam and the DevOps Days Eindhoven conferences. I'm a Microsoft MVP for developer technologies. I organize way too many meetups, including also the DevRel Salon in Amsterdam, that's for developer relations people, and also the open source data infrastructure meetup in Amsterdam. I'm absolutely karaoke enthusiast, so if there's anyone up for karaoke later today, hit me up. And I love the example in the keynote, if you were there, with the chicken with the little, muscular arms. I own chickens, so I definitely need to get on that and get those arms. I also put a sort of party picture there because I'm going to talk about licenses and I don't want you to think that I'm boring. I promise you, I'm really not. All right. So for a period of time, I organized this virtual meetup that was called Contributing Today, or it's still called Contributing Today. And my code organizers and I, we would invite maintainers of open source projects and generally people from the open source community to talk about a whole range of things. That was, for instance, mental health in open source, or documentation, or funding for open source, community items. But also, in one episode, we talked about licenses. And we talked about licenses with people from the Open Source Initiative, from the Ethical Source Movement, from Tidelift, and from Clearly Defined. And I learned a couple of things. So for instance, I learned that combining licenses for one project, so not a license for a project's core and then a project's documentation, is something that you can do, but it's mostly great for lawyers, and it's definitely not great for your users' license compliance journey. I also learned that most developers can't tell the difference between an MIT license, Apache license, AGPL, and that if they're lucky, they might choose a license that is common in their ecosystem and well understood in their ecosystem. So for instance, Python typically uses a typical license, and they might adopt that license if they're developing a component in the Python ecosystem. I also learned that if you think about building a business around your project, maybe ultimately, you need to think really hard about what license you're adopting. Because unless you've been doing contributor license agreements, it is really hard to get all of those contributions that you've been receiving into to use those in your code base. And contributors are really hard to actually reach out to. Like, you're all on GitHub. People operate under a nickname. They don't always list their email address. They might have moved on from the project, right? Or from the platform entirely. You have those people too. They might have passed away. And so you risk having to rewrite whole parts of your application or of your projects because you can't use the code that someone else submitted to your project unless you've been using CLAs. And also, you will need to release a major version, like semantically, because you'll introduce a breaking change to your API as well. And that's difficult. That can cause loss of community, especially when you're doing a license change and the release just before the license change gets forked and released under a more community-friendly license. So you might actually lose some of the contributors that you have gained in the past. I also wouldn't have your license for your project depend on whether or not you can secure funding. This is a thing that has actually happened because a contributor will think twice about contributing to a project that might change the way just how open they are, right? Right. I have a clicker. Look at that. All right. On the topic of not so open, in recent years we have seen an increase in kind of open source licenses that in some cases just straight conflict with the free software definition, which is the right to use software for any purpose, or with the open source definition in that the license shall not restrict any party from selling or giving away the software. So let's look at some of those new licenses, shall we? There is, for instance, the Commons Clause, which aims to restrict commercial free writing on open source code, especially cloud providers who open source people think don't contribute back to open source. But in the Commons Clause, there is a lot of ambiguous wording. So for instance, it says value derived entirely or substantially. And that's ambiguous because what is considered substantial? Could be a moving target. So Mongo used it for a while, and Redis Labs did as well. Redis actually combined it with the Apache license, so they had that dual license that I talked about before. But both moved to a more non-standard available source or cloud-restricted licenses after. For instance, MongoDB moved to SSPL in 2018, which kind of like the GPL, but then with more restrictions. And it's not approved by the open source initiatives, who are, by the way, the stewards of the open source definitions that you saw on the slide just before this. SSPL forces wide copyleft impact on cloud infrastructure, and as a justification, of course, again, the notion that large cloud vendors capture all of the value but give nothing back to the open source community. In this case, the anger was directed at Amazon Web Services in particular. AWS then released DocumentDB sometime later, and then the MongoDB community was divided over this license change. We have Redis source available for certain Redis modules created by Redis, while core Redis stays under the BSD3, if you know that one too. The TLDR, I'm throwing acronyms at you now anyway, so TLDR, it's a license to do all of the usual actions. That means use, modify, distribute, copy, and sub-license, except when your application is distributed or made available as a database product. So that's to allow the community to still build their applications, but not to make it available for use as or in database products that they can then sell, because you guessed it, cloud providers is where you then say, because you guessed it. Thank you. Some people are awake. That's good. So there's a bunch of other licenses, like, for instance, the timescale license, which basically says no timescale as a service and no forking. There is the Confluent Community license, which says you can totally use and modify, distribute, unless that would compete with our business, which again could also be a moving skill because their business could change. And then there are ethical licenses, like, for instance, the Hippocratic license, which is a license that prohibits use of software in violation of internationally recognized human rights, or the ML5, which makes an explicit connection between the license and the code of conduct. If you're interested in ethical licenses, I would go to ethicalsource.dev, because it's a really interesting movement, but I'm not going to talk about this anymore in my talk today. All right. Had any of you heard of any of those licenses that were on that slide? Yes, good. All right. And I know what you're thinking, because I'm pretending to know what you're thinking, that open source is not about licenses, right? Like, licenses should only be about, a way to formalize the relationship, to set expectations, because open source is about community and open and sharing and transparency and all those beautiful things. But I think that discussion around the cloud restricted licenses was a really important one to have within the community, because it makes us realize that open source is really not a business model. So the companies that have, and the projects that have changed their license to restrict what cloud vendors can do with their software, were really not okay with cloud vendors making money over their product and not their commercial business instead. But these new licenses are actually kind of detrimental to the ecosystem, because they take the code and the project private, right? They're not open source anymore. Those licenses are not approved by the OSI, and so they're not technically open source anymore. And it divides community, right? Because people that were previously contributing or interacting in an open source project are no longer there, or they are there and very unhappy. That could also be the case. But Mongo and Elastic argued that, yes, this was very, very necessary for their business, for the sustainability of their business. But GNU Linux is used commercially by everyone, and they're still thriving despite of, or maybe because of, them being available for everyone. And MongoDB and Elastic were really big companies in their own right before their license changed too. So again, even if we're taking enforceability out of the picture, because actually, like, suing and winning in copyright cases is actually really, really hard and a really long process. But say that, that's an actual thing. Changing to a more restrictive license might cause companies and community members to step away. So while they prevent free writing, because Azure, AWS, all of those are not actually using these projects anymore, they created their own. Or they created a fork, they also pushed the open source community to create a lot of alternatives or switch to tools, which actually is not a bad thing. All right. I'm doing a clicker end thing. I'll figure it out. All right. So Pamela Chestek, who is a member of the board of directors of the Open Source Initiative and the current chair of the license committee there, introduced proposed changes to the license review process at the OSI at FOSDEM earlier this year. Who was at FOSDEM? I'm still doing the participatory thing. No FOSDEM. No FOSDEM people. Okay. It's this massive open source conference, if you didn't know, in Brussels. Like, I don't know, 12,000 people in, you don't register because it's open source, right? Like, so you just sort of show up with, you know, a good attitude. Anyway, in her talk about these changes to the license review process, she said something sort of off the cuff that evaluating whether there should be a process for decertifying licenses. She said it's not something that was discussed in a working group, but she did mention that just because something that was approved in the past, so a license that was approved in the past, doesn't mean that it would be approved today. But they just don't have a process of decertifying licenses just yet. Which I thought was interesting, maybe a little bit of a red flag. Maybe that is something that the OSI should look at in the future. All right, a couple of things. There's a lot of text on this slide, I'm sorry. I will talk you through it. A couple of things that Pamela had told us that they're going to introduce is for licenses from now on to have three categories, which is rejected, approved, and preferred, and that would take from actual adoption metrics how many people were actually using a license, so that maybe people can make a better decision what is a well understood license. To also provide more explanation for the public on the decision-making process, I'm sorry, and in particular the role that the license review peoples are and which decisions they take. For all new licenses, for all licenses new and the legacy license, the submission process will require that the license submitter affirmatively states that the license complies with the open source definition, including specifically point 3, 5, 6, and 9 from the open source definition. Let's have a look at that. Because he said those are the ones that normally trip people up, literally use those words. All right, so, and also to identify what projects are already using a license, if any, which at that point, someone in the audience was like, but if they're using a license before it's approved by the OSI, isn't that sort of like putting the cart in front of the horse? Like, that doesn't make a lot of sense, which, well, interesting discussion. And for any new licenses created today, right, the one who's submitting needs to describe what gap is not filled by an existing license that new license will fill. They need to compare it and contrast it with the most popular OSI approved licenses. They need to describe any legal review that the license has undergone English. And if it was drafted by a lawyer, yes or no. They need to provide examples of others' potential use of the license so that it's not a license that is only useful for their particular use case. And new from an approval standpoint is that the license must be reusable, meaning that it can be used by other licenses without changing the terms drastically. The license does not have terms that structurally put the licensor in favor of other people. And it must be possible to comply with the license upon submission. So just as a side note there, given the wide copyleft scope of SSPL, if that would be submitted today, people would not be able to comply with it today. So that would have not been approved today. All right. Okay, so with all of these new licenses to choose from, let's look at some of the projects that have recently switched license to. So Lightbend changed Akka's license from Apache 2.0 to BSL version 1.1. That's a business source license. That's what that acronym stands for. Starting with Akka 2.7, which was released in October last year. So sidetrend, that should have really been Akka 3, right? Because it's a major change to change your license and you're introducing breaking changes. But let's park that discussion because we only have so much time today. And, you know, I don't want to get angry already this early in the morning. And whenever such a change is announced, there's usually, talk of a fork, and especially a fork that will then get a very copyleft license, because then all the new community contributions that are made will the original, like the now proprietary licensed project, can't actually benefit from those. But the question is how productive that is, and if like hurting our fellow developers is anything but misdirected anger. Anyway, in the case of Akka, Apache is actually now incubating Pecco, which is a fork of Akka. And some of the OSPO, or Open Source Program Office at Ivan, is actually involved in this project that is obviously licensed under Apache 2.0, so no copyleft. Another example then. When Elastic released the publication informing about their license change, I think it's fair to say that a shockwave went through the community. The Elastic 2.0 license has clauses that prevent hosted or managed services from using the project, and it's very copyleft style, like SSPL, prevents third-party parties from obscuring trademark notices and branding, and it can even embed license keys, which is very much not an open source thing, to prevent circumvention. And its impact is Elastic, Kibana, all of those got removed from hosted service infrastructure like Azure and AWS. But that was kind of the point, so that was not a surprise. And several players eventually decided to fork Elastic, or the version before the license change, including AWS and also Ivan. So I don't know if you've used OpenSearch yet, but it's an interesting tool. Definitely recommend checking it out. Reference time. So Dotan Horowitz actually talked about the Elastic changing their license, and has a wonderful talk around it that is called "When Your Open Source Tool Turns to the Dark Side," and you can find it at the recordings of FOSS Backstage last year, 2022. It's a really fun talk to check out. Or fun. I say fun. It's really not fun. It's just like horrible. All right, so another example, Grafana, Loki, and Tempo relicensed from Apache to AGPL, which is the Affero General Public License, and is a very infectious copyleft license. The Cloud Native Computing Foundation, CNCF, in response to the license change of third-party components to AGPL, encourages people to switch to an alternative component, or freeze the component to the version just before the license change, and ultimately maybe seek an exception from the board, but really that is not what they recommend. So needless to say, they are not great friends, like they're not friends, right? And they're no fans, so this is not supported. All right. If you were in the online days of this conference yesterday and the day before, and you've paid attention, Rick Marsalis mentioned SBOMs in his keynote yesterday. That was quality for DevOps teams, and David too in his DevSecOps talk. So a software bill of materials, an SBOM, is a list of open source and third-party components present in a code base. An SBOM also captures the license that govern those components, the versions of the components that are used in the code base, and their patch status, and that allows security teams to quickly identify any security or license risk. Who has heard about SBOMs before? A couple of people. That's good. Do you action those? I don't see a lot of nodding. Who's responsible for the SBOM? You can shout. You don't know, or you don't know. Developers? Maybe platform engineers? Okay. Can we get some more answers? Okay. All right. So since for many organizations, thinking about open source is very reactive, it often falls on the plate of security. It's security having to deal with the mess rather than being involved from the get-go, right? Also, legal is often reactive too, since their compliance processes are typically arduous, and so people try and circumvent those. So the official answer, I think, is security. Also because if a company already has an open source program office, and not too many companies have an OSPO yet, even if they understand the context of open source, rarely will they have the budget or like executive sponsorship to actually do anything but maybe create and maintain the SBOM, but not actually to action it, which is the more important part of it. And so I heard a couple of different answers. I gave you a couple of different answers. So when an SBOM, like creating it, maintaining it, and actioning it, is everyone's responsibility, it's no one's responsibility, right? But if you're already practicing DevOps, then maybe there's an answer for you, because there are software composition analysis tools that can help you create an SBOM to integrate, and you can just integrate it in your pipeline. So, for instance, Thomas Steenbergen, who is a Dutch person living in Berlin, wrote this OSS review toolkit, or ORT for short, because again, we love acronyms. And it can be integrated in your GitHub Actions or GitLab or Jenkins or what have you. And it's well understood that developers write code to solve a problem, not to generate an SBOM. So integrated into the pipeline is a much easier way of creating and maintaining that. Actually had a call with Thomas, and that's literally the quote of that he said on the slide. So ORT's goal is basically to enable those software composition reports in open standard format, and license security and best practices checks during source creation by providing an easy, I'm quoting this, easy, open source, and scalable tooling for developers and OSPOs. If you work in a larger organization, you know this to be true, and different teams in an organization will often rely on the same software without even, or open source components, without knowing that they all use the same open source components, unless they practice some sort of like inner source, or they have like these communities of practice and they come together and talk about Postgres, and then all of them are suddenly realizing that they're all using Postgres for some reason. And so instead of doing these scans on a team level, ORT can also do those scans on an organization level and figure out, you will remember Log4j. So not only figure out if that team is using Log4j, but what all teams are using Log4j. And beyond sort of the dependency graph that I touched on earlier, like it's scary, like all of those like branches that sort of branch out as branches do, we need to retrieve all of the source code, which is what ORT does, to detect all license and copyright issues. And license issues aren't actually really binary. It's not like a thumbs up or thumbs down. If there's combined licenses, if the license is appended by something, it's not a really, it's not a very binary thing. So you'll have compliance levels, and maybe the license exposure for a certain project is less critical than for another project. So it's important to sort of like set those levers too. But also, because something is on the internet today doesn't mean it's on the internet in 10 years, right? Or even 10 days. Because stuff gets yanked for all kinds of reasons, right? Like maintainers are humans, so sometimes they'll be protesting the use of their component by someone they consider evil, or they burn out, or a malicious actor shows up in the shape or the costume of a wonderful contributor and they push some malicious code, right? Or the bus factor, right? Like all of these things. We're relying on all of these components, but do we really know if they're healthy and they will be there for the prosperity? So ORT will also need all source code so that they can create an archive, and you can fall back to that once something topples over. All right. I sort of sound like an ORT salesperson, but it's all open source, so like I can't actually make much money out of it. And it's based on computable rules. That means policy is code. You understand that. And when something doesn't check out, you get notified via email or a Jira ticket or whatever you've configured a way to, I don't know, you get paged maybe, if that's something you do. ORT can spit out reports in all kinds of different formats, so machine readable, human readable, manager readable, because they also can create a PDF. And it's designed to not live in a vacuum. That's why it's in your pipeline. So it also checks out all of the scanning of all of the projects that are living in your organization, so that there's alignment across all of those projects. Right, and maybe despite the romantic idea that we have about containers that make it so easy to figure out, like all the things that we're using, it's really not, because getting any kind of like SBOM compliant information out of a container is actually really, really hard. Because package managers are a little bit like black boxes. By the way, another side rant, sorry. Did you know that black boxes are not actually black? They're more like orange or red, and they're sort of round, because that makes sense, right? Because if they get dropped in the ocean or in snow or whatever, you can actually find them, while black box might be a little bit harder. Anyway, just, fun fact. The point is, these things are not transparent, and it's a good thing that generally there is a standards movement going on in this area, encouraged by the impending Cyber Resilience Act and the Interoperability Act, if you're familiar with any of those. If you're not, look them up after. So, if you want to know more about ORT or the reasons behind this project, you can check out Fallback Stage 2023 recording with Thomas Teunberge and the team. Super interesting talk. And there's also a GitHub action for you to fork and use and try and see if it works for your projects. Just experiment with it. So, try out any of those two links. I might post the slides later. Otherwise, take a picture. 3, 2, 1. Okay. Good. Aside from, building something into your pipeline, so it's like obvious, something that's happened, it's something that continuously happens. I have talked to a lot of companies and about license and dependency management. And I'd like you to humor me for some of the solutions that I've seen in the wild and why they might not be perfect solutions. So I've heard as a solution for dependency management and also license management is to just have a mirror of all of the components that you have in use. While that might be useful in some cases because stuff don't get maintained, but then also if it's not maintained, maybe take over the project, or I don't know, like switch to an alternative. But if having a mirror of all of the components that you have in use means that you're now the maintainer of a bunch of mirrors. And like, I don't know if that's something that you aspire for yourself, but I've never had that sort of dream. But also, sometimes vulnerabilities are in the code for many days, weeks, months, years until they get fixed. And so new releases, they bring vulnerability patches as well, right? So, and you want to benefit from those. There's also an example from a really big bank that shall remain unnamed. They presented at a conference recently and presented a slide with all of the components that they have in use, like all of the components in their setup. And there were a couple of open source tools there with version numbers attached to them. And so I checked these tools, and it was like, for instance, like Helm and Splunk and Flux and all of these services. And a non-trivial amount of them were many major versions behind. And so I asked about their update strategy, and they're like, there is none. Like, these are the versions that work for us, and we've pinned into those versions, and that's what we're going with. At that point, like, I didn't know what to say. I was like, cool. Yeah, okay, good. I might move away my accounts to another bank, although might not be better at another bank. Again, this sort of like approach, you won't be able to benefit from any of the improvements either, right? And it might just make a lot more sense to have some open source awareness inside your company, if that's sort of formalized in an open source program office, or just a couple of people that just care about it a lot and talk to senior leadership team about this a lot, and sort of like develop this ability to recognize and support healthy projects, thriving projects, and steer away from projects that are not healthy and not thriving. So that's an entire talk in and of itself, and actually did that talk at FOSDEM this year. And there's a blog post. So if you want to find out more, again, take a picture and you can read that one. And I love that there's a little bit of a movement going on where at more conferences there's talk of how to build lasting, sustainable open source communities. Super important. But because when you recognize what is healthy and what is a healthy project and what isn't a healthy project, that will allow you to do due diligence of the alternatives, right? Something wonderful about the open source community, there are alternatives to alternatives to alternatives. Wonderful. So make use of that. Especially for some of the components that you rely on that are critical pieces of your infrastructure, make sure that you know what the alternatives are and if they interrupt with your code base well. Yeah, and of course, introduce open source license management in your pipelines. So we looked at some projects that were relicensed recently and the impact thereof. We know that we should track and manage our license dependencies as part of our CI/CD, perhaps with ORT, but I won't be angry with you if you don't. And hopefully we learned a little bit about how to be better set up to respond to projects that are changing terms. And I'd love to thank you. If you have any questions, we can do that now, but also I'll be here all day and tomorrow too. So you can also just find me.